everyone. Thank you for attending the Navigating the F32 grant process session. So this session is being put on by COMPAS, which is the Committee for Graduate Students and Postdocs within the American Society for Cell Biology. My name is Valerie Tutwiler, and I'll be moderating the session today along with Scott Wilkinson, who is another member of COMPAS. So throughout the presentation, please feel free to send questions via the question and answer box. Scott and I will be answering some questions within this box, and others we will be saving and asking live during the panel portion of the presentation for our speaker, Dr. Corbett, and our panelists. So I would just like to take a moment to introduce Dr. Corbett and to thank her for taking the time out today to give this presentation. So Dr. Corbett is a professor in biology at Emory. She is also the co-director for their MD-PhD program and 2 additional NIH-based training programs that support diversity and inclusion in STEM fields. Beyond her research, Dr. Corbett is a major supporter of mentoring and student training and has a lot of experience with mentoring toward scientific grant writing and teaches a course related to this topic as well. So we are very excited to have her here and present the third in our series of grant writing workshops and webinars. Specifically, this one is focused on F32. So Dr. Corbett, you can get started. Again, please feel free to send questions throughout the Q&A throughout the webinar, and we will be having our panelists join us after the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Val, for the introduction and the invitation to be here today to talk about this grant writing process. I always like to point out at the beginning of these presentations, which I'm allotted about 15 minutes to give, that normally I teach a whole semester course on this topic. So here is my attempt to distill down some of the really key points that come across in that semester-long course in just a few minutes. And so let's start by first just putting everyone on the same page and make sure to define the NIH speak that we're all using, which is this F32 mechanism. So here we're referring to the first error on my slide, which this is a postdoctoral grant program. So this F32 mechanism, it's up to 3 years of stipend support. So of course it comes with some nice money where you get your postdoctoral stipend paid for under the NIH guidelines that they set for stipends each year. You also get some money for travel and supplies, which is nice because it gives you a little bit more independence with respect to your project and your training as a postdoc. In order to be eligible for these grants, you do have to be a US citizen or permanent resident, and you have to have either a clinical or a research doctoral degree. And an important thing about these grants that makes them distinct from your typical research grant is that this is a training grant. So it's a training grant to train you, the applicant. And what that means is that what is being evaluated in this proposal is more than just the research that you're going to propose. We all tend to really focus on the research part, but for these proposals, it really is a whole package that is being evaluated, taking into consideration you as a candidate and other components, and I'll touch on those topics. And so that's the question of how will the grant be judged, right? So there are 5 formal criteria that all have to create a cohesive narrative. So you really have to put together the full package and a full story. And what's going to be judged is the candidate, so that's you, your sponsor and collaborators, your research proposal. So this is the science. This is what we tend to all focus on. Other things that are going to be judged that we probably don't think about nearly as much are the training potential. So what are you going to learn during this period of your training that's going to be critical to set you up to move to the next stage in your career trajectory? And then as part of that, as in addition, the institutional environment and commitment to training is also judged. And so if you think about that, a lot of these things come down to this training potential or training aspect of the proposal. Are you a good candidate? Do you have the potential to be trained? have you picked a lab and a sponsor as well as collaborators that are going to provide good training for you? The research proposal is actually even called the research training proposal. So is the research you're proposing going to provide a good training environment for you? And then the institute and environment that you're in, that commitment to training that's evident there, again, contributes to the training potential. So it's really thinking about the whole package and everything as this training mechanism. And so just to put this in context, and Val gave a nice introduction, but I think it's always good for you to know who I am and why you should listen to what I have to say about this topic for the next few minutes. So this is one of the first time in this grant process I get to say I'm actually a former F32 recipient from several years ago. I've been a biology professor for more than 20 years. I am the co-director at Emory of a program that specifically trains postdocs. So this ERACTA training program, which here at Emory is called FIRST. Val mentioned that I've been teaching this class, a grant writing class, which indeed is a whole semester course. We've been teaching it for more than 20 years. At Emory, we focus on teaching that class to graduate students, but I have had several postdocs sit in as well because the structures of graduate student and postdoctoral grants are fairly similar, except for some points I'm going to hit on later. Multiple postdocs from my group currently have their own grants, and you'll get a chance to meet one of them on the panel. And I've also reviewed these grants for many different types of agencies, including NIH. So I have perspective from both the point of view of helping trainees to write the grants and reviewing the grants, and even from having written one of my own many, many, many years ago. And so why would you want to write one of these grants? Well, hopefully if you've bothered to take the time out of your busy schedule to attend this webinar, you have some ideas, but there are some really valuable points to it that go beyond, obviously, just getting the research money. One that I found is that it's just incredibly valuable to plan out your research project. So my strategy for postdocs who come to my lab is that we write these grants really at the outset. And so it's an experience of us working together, which gets to the next point on this slide, early experience of writing with your mentor if you're the one writing the grant. And really planning out the research project. What's the hypothesis you're going to test? How are you going to go about it? This also does give you obviously a sense of independence in your research. So if you have your own stipend, you have your money for travel, it clearly gives you the ability to be very independent. It does, as I already mentioned, give you some additional resources and money. It's a really important CV builder, and this scientific writing and grant writing is a critical skill. This is really an important thing to add to your track record of what you've accomplished, and having a track record of extramural funding. This is really key for faculty jobs. So for example, I sit on many, many faculty search committees, and one of the things I really like to see is just some evidence that somewhere along the line, someone who's applying for a faculty position actually has a record of writing a grant and convincing someone to give them some money to do their science. So these are really important reasons that kind of go beyond just the, it'll be great to have my own money point of view. So then the how, and I do spend an entire semester on this, so I'm really going to talk about just some general strategies and then speak to some that I think are valuable specifically for postdocs. So in any type of scientific communication, the point of know your audience. So when you're writing this proposal, where is your proposal going? Which NIH institute are you sending it to? Who will review this proposal? So what are called fellowship or F panels that review these types of grants have very, very broad knowledge base. And so you really need to be writing your proposal for a knowledgeable scientist, but not someone specifically in your field. And that's pretty different than it might be for your mentor who's used to writing a research grant to a very focused study section. I already mentioned that it's really important to understand the proposal mechanism. So these postdoctoral proposals are training grants. And so you need to be thinking about all these other pieces. And I'll give you a slide in just a minute that illustrates some of these other pieces or gives you a list. One that seems like a complete no-brainer, but follow the directions. So there are lots and lots of very specific directions. And the very first step is just being able to follow those directions. And that seems easy until you start looking at the detailed directions, because man, there are a lot of them and they change rapidly. And then it is really important to make sure that your mentor or sponsor is on board with your task, right? So this has components that are actually provided by your sponsor. And if they are not on board with working together with you, not only to provide those specific pieces of the proposal, but also to work with you to develop your research plan, it's going to be very challenging. And then my piece of advice for any of these types of grants, anytime anyone in my lab writes a grant, get a successful example. So there's nothing more valuable than an example of something that someone has written that's worked, because then you can look through it. And as much as possible, it's really great. The folks at NIH, and these would be the program officers specifically, and I'll illustrate exactly kind of what I mean by that in a later slide. The program officers can be really, really valuable in terms of helping you decide what your grant is appropriate for, which, should it be going to the National Cancer Institute, should it be going to the National Institute of General Medical Science, and then also to help you with which study sections to go to. They really do offer a lot of valuable help. And so this is the kind of scary slide for people who haven't embarked on this type of endeavor before. So the how, what are the parts of this grant? And so you see down there in blue, the science part, right? That's a specific aims page and 6 pages of research strategy. And so when most of us think about a grant, of course, that's what we think about, right? The science. But you know, there is all this other stuff that you need to put together these proposals. And you really do need all these pieces to kind of hang together. It's not quite as scary as all this, because if you color code some of these things, what you see is that the things in red, descriptions of the facilities, the equipment that you're going to have, some other pieces that are really specific to NIH grants, how you're going to share the resources, how you're going to authenticate the stuff you have, if you're going to use vertebrate animals, or if you need IRB approval. Most of those things are probably things your mentor has a version of, and you can just take it and edit it. The things in purple, support letters from collaborators, of course, you would need to reach out and get those, but those are things that someone else is going to write. I already briefly referred to this section 2 from the sponsor. That's what your mentor would actually be writing. And that is also 6 pages, just like the research strategy part. So it's a big part that describes how you are going to be trained in the course of this postdoctoral experience. And then you do need to request 3 recommendation letters. And your sponsor's letter is not a recommendation letter. So these should be people that can evaluate you as a scientist. But at least that stuff in purple is other things. You do have to do something, but you don't actually have to write it. And so that does leave quite a few little bits and pieces that you do have to write, but some of the things you probably have written before: applicants' background and goals for the fellowship training, doctoral dissertation and research experience. You know, you probably wrote about some of that when you were applying for postdocs, your training goals and objectives, activities planned under this award. All of it has to do with this narrative of saying, how is this experience, doing this set of research experiments, working with this mentor in this environment, going to help you train you for the next stage of your career? And if you're writing these F32 applications, typically that next stage of your career would be some sort of independent research position, most likely a faculty position, but not always. And so these are some points that I find to be very helpful and specific to the F32 or the postdoctoral part of this. So one of the points is start the conversation early about what you can take with you to start your own independent group. So I always suggest you start this conversation when you interview for the position. Because if a reviewer is reading an F32 application and the goal of that is to give you training during your postdoctoral training period, what they want to see is that as part of that training, you're going to be developing something that you are going to be able to take with you and you're going to be able to develop in your own independent research program. And so having that conversation very early and discussing with the mentor how you might, a really common thing to do would be to have two aims that are, a specific thing closely related to work going on in the mentor's lab, but then maybe aim 3 is something that takes you off in a different direction and clearly gives you a jumping off point for your own independent research. Some things we don't typically think about for a postdoc, consider a mentoring committee. So this would be akin to a thesis committee that you would have had in graduate school. I often suggest that the postdocs include a junior faculty member. So this is someone who can be really valuable to them because they've just navigated this job hunt process. I do think it can be really helpful to seek formal grant writing classes, workshops, sometimes locally. I know our postdoc office has a series they offer, and also a number of meetings will start like before the meeting, they'll have a virtual or they'll have a grant writing class. And then advice for every grant, start early and get feedback. And then finally, just a kind of a few points around actually developing the research project. If you're doing this with the timing that I prefer, which is sort of as you transition into the lab, you're going to be learning about that area. So you have to be thinking about what's the general area, why is it important, and something that people who've interacted with me might be familiar with hearing, the why should I care? Make me care about what you're doing, why it's important. Identify the key questions, the gaps in knowledge. You'll have to think about existing preliminary data, and this can be pretty challenging if you're just coming into a lab because you're not familiar with the information. So that, part of it is finding out what type of preliminary data exists to support what you're proposing to do. Then obviously at some point you have to decide what experiments you'll pursue and figure out how to write those as, a narrative and write them based on experiments and what results would mean and how those would fit into your model. And then this point coming back to at least one aim, ideally, would develop something that you can take with you, and always consider the impact of the work and always be attempting to drive home the impact of the work. So when? This is where sooner rather than later, this is certainly my opinion. There's a little bit of a difference of opinion here. Some people think that you should come in, gather some preliminary data and write a grant. I really like the idea of using this as a way to develop your approach and the project that you're going to do in the lab. If you apply early, then you can always revise the grant, which often you get the lucky opportunity to do. And at that point, you'll have a little bit more preliminary data. I will say that preliminary data expectations do tend to correlate with the time in the lab when you apply. So reviewers notice this, right? They notice if you started in the lab in September and you've submitted this grant in December, they realize you haven't had a lot of time. But if you've been in the lab in a year and a half and you submit a grant without a lot of preliminary data, they're also going to notice that. I would say you have to have a published first author paper from your graduate work. You're pretty much dead in the water if your paper is not published. We could talk about whether being on bioarchives is good enough. It might be that at your initial submission, the paper's submitted and later it's published, but it definitely makes it challenging. And then to the when question, the sooner you can start before the various deadlines, which are April, August, and December 8th, the better. And just to return to this idea of, I keep talking about how your grant is going to be evaluated and that it's going to be broadly evaluated. The mechanism by which the peer review system works is someone at your institute hits a button that sends all those lovely documents all collated to the NIH, where someone called a scientific review officer helps to make decisions based on a cover letter and your suggestions about where the grant will go, what study section will review it. 3 people read the grant in detail. They then go sit around in a room or on a Zoom computer screen at the moment and discuss the grants. Each grant gets about 5 to 10 minutes. And based on the opinions of those assigned reviewers, everyone in the room gives the grant a score. That score then accompanied by comments. If you're lucky, equals a notice of award. That's the time when a program officer would be part of the discussion. Likely you would reach out to them to discuss your score and your comments and try and understand from them what your next move would be. Is it going to be to revise the grant? Do they just need you to provide some sort of feedback about some comments or constructive criticism that might have been there? And so that's the process in a nutshell for the peer review system. And that describes NIH specifically, but is pretty similar for almost every place that a grant would go. And so that just is summarized here again with sort of the process of going to the 3 reviewers, that they're the ones who read it in detail. The process in the study section is the reviewers provide preliminary scores. They sort of make describe the grant, what are the strengths and weaknesses, people can ask questions, and then they return and revise the scores. And so here's just a list of resources. And I think for the purposes of discussion or questions, we could just end on kind of this summary of some of the documents you need. And with that, I will be happy to bring the rest of the panel into the conversation and answer any questions you guys might have.
Thank you, Anita. That was really great. So panelists, if you would like to unmute your audio and start up your video, we can get started with answering some of the different questions that we have. So for our panelists, if you would like to introduce yourselves, you can just tell us your name, your institution, and when you got your F32, if you don't mind. You should all be here.
It's saying that we can't start our video.
Yes.
Oh, well, I guess for now, if you want to just talk, and hopefully we can get that issue resolved with respect to getting your videos started. But if we can hear you, so if you do want to introduce yourself so that we can move forward with some of the questions, that would be great.
Any particular order? Or just...
Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, I guess Derrick, you can go first. And then if we want to go, we can do Derrick, Jessica, and then Callie.
Yes, and it does say the host needs to turn our cameras back on. So okay. I'm Derrick Morton and did my postdoctoral fellowship in Anita's lab at Emory. I got my F32 in 2017 and funded from NIGMS. I am working in neurodegenerative diseases and looking at how RNA processing defects cause those diseases.
Okay, I guess we'll go next. My name is Jessica Konen. I'm currently in my 4th year of my postdoc at MD Anderson. I received my F32 just in December of this past year. So I'm only a few months into it. And this was actually after a resubmission. So I can actually address any questions that people may have about what it takes to resubmit an application. And I did also receive an F31 during graduate school. So I can speak about the differences and similarities there as well.
And my name is Callie Wigington. I am currently a postdoc in the biology department at Stanford University. I received my F32 from NIGMS starting in 2016. I had 2 years of funding from the award, so I've now wrapped up the F32. As a graduate student at Emory, I also had an F31 awarded as well.
All right, thank you all for introducing yourselves. So we'll get started with the first question. So Anita, you mentioned that it's good to start writing early. How early is too early? Can you start writing your F32 before you've even physically started in the lab while you're still wrapping up your PhD program?
Yeah, I definitely think you can. I think in order to do that, you do need to be working closely with your mentor. And we have some people here who have some slightly different experiences, it sounds like. So it'd be good to hear Derrick had about that experience, and it sounds like Jessica did it a little later. So I'd be curious what you guys have, your thoughts on that.
Well, I would definitely think starting early. So in my postdoc, we started writing my grant as soon as I came in the door, which was a bit much for me, switching model systems in question, but it actually helped kind of outline the whole project. And I was able to collect some data while putting together the grant as well. And so I would recommend, as soon as you start in the lab, or if you have contact with the PI and they're available right before you join, just to kind of throw ideas around or start on your specific aims page if you can.
Yes, and my experience was a little bit different, as Anita mentioned. So while I didn't apply for my F32 until I was about 1.5 years in, I did apply for other smaller, like society level grants, which did give me that same sort of experience as far as putting together my project and thinking critically about what it was I was trying to do. So that I actually was pretty well set up by the time I wanted to write my F32. It made the process for that a little bit easier. And though, like Anita mentioned, because that was a little bit later, I did feel like I needed to put in quite a bit of preliminary data to really support my aims as well. So something definitely consider if you go that route, that you'll definitely need some good, strong data to support your aims for sure.
Callie, I think you did yours pretty early as well, didn't you?
I did. I would say that I did not even consider starting to write before I physically joined the lab, because I had a pretty crunched schedule finishing up my PhD, so that wouldn't have been feasible. But as soon as I physically joined Martha, my boss's lab here at Stanford, we started having very specific conversations about writing the award. And then over the next probably 4 to 6 months of the beginning of my postdoc was when we started kind of framing up ideas that we knew were going to be a big part of the research proposal. So pretty early, but it takes a while to start to hone in on the specific questions that you want to ask sometimes. So it kind of morphs over time.
All right, thank you all. So we have a series of questions about identifying the best sponsor for your project. So is your sponsor, your primary sponsor anyway, always your PI? Or can you have a sponsor that is somebody different from your primary postdoc PI? And what approaches can you have if your PI is still an early career researcher? Will that hurt your application? Would it be better to have a mentoring team in that case? Those types of questions around identifying the best mentors.
Yeah, I would say, so I mean, your sponsor pretty much has to be your primary mentor, but definitely there are a common strategy in my lab, and this is true definitely for Derrick, is having co-sponsors. A lot of that has to do, the main thing I always say about co-sponsors is it really has to be driven by the science. And so that's part of the reason why I brought up this point about having these conversations about the proposal and the research project and what you might be able to take away with you from the research project while you're interviewing. So starting those conversations then, rather than getting into the lab and then starting to talk about a grant and finding out that there's no piece that you're allowed to take away from you. Junior sponsors, it definitely can work. And I certainly know colleagues, junior people who've had postdocs get grants. My very first postdoc got her grant. But if there is a scientifically driven reason to have a more senior person as a co-sponsor, that can be a good strategy. I don't know if any of the panelists have a thought or a comment on that, or if that's something you guys took into consideration when you were identifying your labs.
I had a co-sponsor for my F31 award, which I know we're not specifically talking about today, but to Anita's point, definitely the research questions that I was asking were in some ways outside the scope of work that was being done in Anita's lab. So the comments that we got back from recruiting a co-sponsor that would help facilitate those experiments was very strong. The review panel thought that that was a smart choice to help ensure that those experiments were going to be carried out appropriately.
Yeah, and I think, as a postdoc, a lot of times that can really help you, because if you're trying to develop your own sort of independent line of investigation, if you are working with two co-sponsors, often you can find something that's kind of at the intersection Derrick, that kind of speaks to your experience as well, correct?
Yes. So in developing mine, I had the co-sponsors, and so and it was driven by the science. So Anita is an expert in RNA biology, and we were thinking about moving into the Drosophila model and modeling some things she had done in yeast, and so that really allowed me to become independent of Anita in a way in writing that in the grant. And so onto the faculty position, I was able to take from both co-sponsors and create something that was out of their kind of wheelhouse and things that they're currently writing grants on.
Jessica, were you going to add something?
Oh, no, I don't have much to add here, really. We went more of a grant committee route for mine. So I didn't have a co-sponsor. My only sponsor was my PI on that. So, but we did have other faculty that we brought in as more of committee members that could provide insight in areas where we lacked.
Which also helps with the training potential, correct?
Definitely, yeah.
Okay, so do any of you have any advice if the postdocs are faced with a PI or a mentor that is not willing to support them writing grants like an F32?
Panelists?
I can comment here. So because it was so important to me to get experience in grant writing, I want to become an independent scientist one day. So it was really important for me. So actually during the interview processes, when I was trying to narrow down which postdoc position I was going to take, that would be one question that I would ask during the interview process before I even chose my lab. So I made sure that, that the PI that I was going to choose was on board with the fact that I would be applying to these grants. And so I'm not sure how to deal with it if you're already in a lab and your PI isn't on board. That's kind of a tough one to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my advice would be to lay out to the PI the advantages of having you apply for such a grant, because clearly it is a relief to their research funds if you get your own grant to do this. And you could also lay out some of the other things about, developing the ideas and how it would help you develop your own independent trajectory. But I do agree with Jessica. I would certainly urge people to have these discussions before rather than after.
Yes, I would say it is a huge time commitment putting together one of these proposals. So if it's an issue of selling your boss on the usefulness of taking the time to write the proposal, I found certainly that it was really helpful for me transitioning from two really different fields from my doctoral work to postdoctoral. It forced me to dive into the literature in this new field probably a bit more thoroughly than I may have if I were just doing experiments in the lab and kind of getting my feet wet that way. So I think that that was a big part of the training to introduce me to this new field. And that really made the experiments that I started doing initially a lot more specific and tailored and probably, well, better thought out than they would have been if I weren't so immersed in the literature from having written this grant.
All right, thank you, Callie. And to build on that, you talked about that you switched fields completely. And Anita, you mentioned the importance earlier of having a publication from your PhD program. But if you do switch fields, will it hurt your application if you don't have any publications in this field that you're switching to? Do you need to get a publication in that area before you submit your F32?
I guess my response to that would always be that you should not wait to get a publication, because that is, well, there are different strategies you can take. There is probably no right and wrong answer. My own personal preference is that you don't wait to get a publication in that field. So it's really important to show that you have productivity, right? To show that you've accomplished something during your PhD, which is why I say it's really critically important to have that paper published. Or at least one paper published from their PhD. But since the training potential is such a big emphasis here, it's really not that you have to show, using Derrick's example, I can work with Drosophila. Here's a paper published showing that I can work with Drosophila. that really isn't typically part of the consideration. I don't know what the panelists' thoughts are on that.
I would agree. I had no publications in the field that I started in my postdoc when I got there. I think you have to have a first author publication accepted to be competitive, but not in the field in which you're starting your postdoc.
All right. Thank you.
I will say just one strategy, because Derrick, we use this, which is, if possible, writing a short sort of review article or some sort of commentary in that area can be helpful and doesn't take nearly as long, right? Because you don't have to collect data. So in Derrick's case, we had been invited to write a review article, so he wrote a review, and I suspect that probably is not terrible, but I don't think it's essential.
Yeah, okay. I remember in the training plan that we kind of crafted between my boss and myself, in the areas in which I was completely new experimentally, she wrote about senior personnel in the lab and specific experiments that they would be helping me with. And so if it were a new model system or a new set of experiments that you would be doing, to speak to specifically how you're going to train someone new in that field and that you have the tools available can help mitigate some of those issues.
All right. So with the current timing of COVID, how much data do you think will be necessary for a successful submission? Do you think that it'll be different than it normally would be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, review panels are going to be giving people a pass for sure. So I think, if people are thinking about submitting for an August deadline, which is the next deadline that's coming up, it certainly may be that there's less data than you were able to have. Again, oh, look, it's Derrick.
Oh, we got Derrick. Oh, everybody's appearing. Awesome.
It certainly is possible that you're going to have less data. I mean, I think I would probably somehow communicate that in a grant, right? Say like, oh, all these experiments were ongoing and I was hoping to have this data to show, like maybe a little note at the top of the research proposal, a little note in the preliminary data section that you put together, saying, these experiments were in progress and unfortunately, I couldn't do them. I would say some people might say, oh, I'll just delay and then submit in December, but I suspect, people are going to be relatively forgiving. Now they're reviewers and we all know reviewers can be crazy, but that's kind of my thought. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that.
Yeah.
You've been writing some grants right now, right? I mean,
who was it for?
I was just saying you've been writing grants, but I guess not research grants so much.
Yeah, I wrote a public enrichment grant to the ASCB actually, but no, not a research grant.
All right. So how independent does your research have to be from the research that's happening in your current PI's lab, and also from previous grants that the lab has submitted or currently has?
Why don't I let the panelists take that one for each of them? Callie, you want me to call on you?
Yeah, I'll go first. So mine was definitely structured. I had two aims, and the first one was really firmly couched in the bread and butter work that my sponsor's lab was already working on, and that I was going to be carving a piece out for myself. So these were experiments that were nicely founded and established and things that I could definitely carry forward. The second aim was still within the scope of experiments that could be done and mentored within my current lab, but was a new direction of research. And so this was a way, and I talked about this in my training plan, was that was how I would begin to start establishing research independence and carving out this piece of the pie for myself. So that's how I dealt with that.
Jessica?
Yeah, so I would say, I was very fortunate when I came into my postdoctoral position because the lab was pretty set up as far as the model systems that they used, and but was lucky in that they had just performed this pretty awesome screen, in vivo screen, that I could then kind of utilize as my jumping point into my postdoc. So while there was a lot of the work in the lab that's already been established, the models, the mouse models, everything like that, I had my own piece of this screen that nobody had really followed up on at all yet. So I could take that and make an entire grant off of this, the couple of hits that I identified from this screen. So I was kind of fortunate in that I didn't have to really compete too much with what was already done in the lab, but I had a good foundation of what had been done in the lab already.
And Derrick.
And so I guess for me, the strength of having co-sponsors, right? I feel like my whole project was carved out just for me. So I was able to take the strengths from Anita's lab and my co-sponsor's lab and put something together that was unique. And utilizing the preliminary data that Anita had already got in her lab, we just created a whole new, question with the Drosophila model. And so I kind of feel like my whole project was always carved out just for me. But in the grant, we were specific to what I would take and how I would utilize my F32 to go on to an independent career.
Yeah, and I think that Derrick brings up a really good point, because this is something that the sponsor would absolutely have to emphasize in their part of the grant is, here's the part that we have discussed. This person is taking it away. I'm not going to work on it anymore, right? I'm supporting them. And so reviewers really do want to see that, because they want to see how this is going to give you that jumping off point for your own independent, trajectory.
Thanks. Okay, so what are the differences between a successful F31 and a successful F32? And does having an F31 help or impact your chances for receiving an F32?
That sounds like Jessica and Callie.
Yes.
Sure, I can kind of jump in a little bit here. So I don't think that it's necessary at all to have an F31 to get an F32. I think it doesn't hurt. Once the NIH has or whatever your funding agency has invested in you once, they're going to want to continue to invest in your training to make you a successful independent scientist. So it definitely doesn't hurt your chances at all. But I also don't think it's good to just say that, I had an F31, so, I don't need to put in that much effort into this F32. There are a lot of differences, like some of the things that we've mentioned as far as thinking about what's next, I think is really important for the F32. Not that it's not important for the F31, but here you're much closer to that being a realization, right? So I think that's one good consideration as well. And I'll also say that I had an F31, and then on my first submission for the F32, I was not discussed. So, it doesn't necessarily mean anything at all as far as, you're automatically going to get that grant. So you still have to work really hard and take all comments into consideration. So yeah, I think it helps, just like it helps to have any other funding to really get the ball rolling for people to believe in your work and believe in you as a scientist.
I agree. I do remember the reviewers in a couple places just commented that I did have an F31, but it wasn't a major thing that they focused on as like a selling point or anything that helps them make the decision on funding my F32. I found that the most beneficial part of having the F31 moving towards the F32 was that some of the sections of the grant that I needed to write, I'd already had really good practice working on. So it certainly helped kind of speed up the F32 process for me a little bit, but that would be true even if you had written an F31 and it didn't get funded. You've gone through that that exercise before. And so that was really helpful for me to kind of remember, okay, these are the parts I need to work on. This is the, kind of framework that I'm in.
I totally agree. It's almost like, oh, I'm sorry, Anita. I was just gonna say, it's almost like it gives you confidence in your next submission. you don't have to feel so overwhelmed at the numerous documents that you have to get completed. You can kind of just take it, one step at a time because you've been through it before.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I would
that's
say
a comment
that,
I was going to make too, because I think, Callie, I recall that you, although your mentor is very senior, I'm not sure there had been very many F32 grants in the lab. So you coming in and saying like, hey, I'm going to do this and I know what to do was really valuable.
Yeah, she had never mentored an F32 applicant before. So it was a lot of bootstrapping on my part and then looking for resources around me. But having gone through a grant writing course as a graduate student and already going through the whole framework of F31 was a huge benefit.
Whereas Derrick had the opposite experience because he just had to jump in without any prelude.
and I would say you don't have to have an F31, and I was funded on the first submission for my F32, so.
Yeah.
All right. So now going in the other direction, there are several questions about applying for F32s versus K99s, how to choose between the two, when to know which one is right, as well as if you should include training plans for applying to future things like a K99 in your F32 plan, if that's what you're submitting. So if any of you or I want to tackle, choosing between the two when each decision is right, that would be really great.
Callie, I know you have some experience in that.
Yes. So I view so I'm in a molecular biology lab. I know that field to field, it can be pretty different because timelines are really different on the types of experiments that people do. But in the molecular biology world where postdocs tend to be a little bit longer, I tend to view the F32 as a much earlier mechanism for training. And I personally, and a colleague of mine in a lab next door, both experienced, we went into the same study section, same time, and we were both within our first year of starting a postdoc, and they were already talking about having already received significant amount of training. So I think that spoke to me as like, okay, the F32 should come fairly early for postdoctoral training. And then the K, because you do need a good bit of preliminary data to support yourself and kind of prop yourself up as someone who truly is going to become an independent investigator, that one more naturally shifts towards the later portion of your postdoc. So I think that when I wrote my F32, I definitely talked about the kind of whole overview of my postdoctoral training and what I wanted it to look like. And I definitely talked about writing career transition awards towards the end, but I didn't spend a lot of time talking about that because I was more focused on the training I was going to get under the F32 award.
Yeah, I would agree with that. F32 very early on and K99 later. The time frames make it hard because there's a 4-year deadline on the K99. So that's, always a big discussion in when you should submit. So it just kind of makes you have to submit the F32 actually a little bit earlier.
So I have a follow-up, a little bit more specific question. So if you're on a training grant, which would affect your overall amount of time you can be on an F32. So if you can only be on the F32 for 1 year for the total of 3 years, would that sway you to still applying for an F32 for that 1 year of funding, or would it be better to apply directly for a K99 in that case?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think that the problem probably comes if you were supported by a T32, for example, for 2 years, and then you're thinking about applying for an F32. I guess Jessica pulled this off to some extent, but she was also revising her grant. So if you've already been in the lab 2 years and you then submit an F32, I suspect you're gonna run into issues with training potential. So definitely, having been on the study section, I would see grants come in that were essentially that, like, I'm almost done, I just need to finish up, and so I need 1 year of funding. I even know all the techniques and everything. That actually doesn't fly at all as an F32 because there's no training. So I guess I would just always encourage people, even if you come in, and in fact, Derrick came into a funded position. He had funding for 3 years in the way he came into his postdoc in my lab, but he has a very mean mentor who still said, it would be better for you to have your own independent funding. So you're going to write this grant. And so even if you have a T32 slot, I just would encourage you to still apply for the F grant.
Great.
I agree.
I'll just out. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I didn't have a T32, but similarly, I'm an ERACTA postdoctoral fellow, and you get 3 years of funding, and you're not the PI of that award. And so I would still recommend writing an independent proposal as soon as you start.
And I was just going to add too that the NIH, the F series aren't the only options for somebody. So if you are looking for a more short-term coverage for grants, then there's other opportunities. I had a career enhancement award for a year through our UT Lungspor. So I would say if you really are just looking for a short-term grant, maybe look for some of these other opportunities that do exist. There might be a better way to go than the F32.
There are also other private foundation postdoctoral fellowships that, depending on your research, could fit some people as well. So on that note, did any of you include, I guess, current or future career and professional development efforts in your training plan when you were submitting your F32, whether it was future grants that you wanted to apply to, fellowships, or different types of programs that you wanted to participate in?
So yes, so definitely we wrote about writing a K award in my grant. I think at the time we found out that I was eligible to apply for a K01, and we wrote that in there. And so yeah, I think anytime that you write in the training section about what's coming up, it allows reviewers to understand that you're actually looking forward, that you want an independent career. And so I would always recommend writing that in.
Yeah, and I know, Callie, that you guys have a really good postdoc office that offers a lot of formal training opportunities. So I suspect you wrote about some of those, correct?
Yeah, I was looking back through my whole grant this morning preparing for this, and I realized how, and this was a piece of advice I wanted to share generally with everyone, is how specific I was about things. I didn't just say, I'm going to attend meetings, I'm going to go to workshops. I listed out this workshop, this meeting, this is what it will do for me. And I think that probably made a big difference, because it's clear that you're not just saying these things, that you've already gone and looked for those resources. And then being somewhere like Stanford, which has a huge postdoc population, I also had the luxury of being able to talk about all these wonderful resources specifically for postdocs. And that's going to be institution dependent, but certainly to be explicit about the training that you're going to be pursuing, I think is hugely beneficial for the review panel, but also for yourself, because then you have those things already researched and you can say, okay, it's summer of 2018. This is when I said I was going to attend this meeting. So let's, make that happen.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, I think there are many institutions have really strong postdoc offices that do have a lot of offering. I mean, there's some formal stuff you have to include, like the RCR, the ethics training, right? And so very often that's offered by some sort of postdoctoral office, but there's a lot of other things they usually do as well.
Awesome. So if you are doing your postdoc in the same lab that you did your PhD in, can you apply for an F32 or other types of postdoctoral fellowships? And if yes, do you have any advice on kind of tailoring your application to address any concerns?
So yes, you can always apply. Are you likely to be successful? If you're doing a postdoc in the same lab you're in, I would almost always say no. What I think you can do is you can stay at the same institution. It's not, but if you stay at the same institution, which sometimes is something that you don't have flexibility or ability to change, and I know examples of this at Emory, people who moved from, a department in a basic science department to the Winship Cancer Institute, changed biological question. I mean, there are three things, right? This is what they always say, right? You can change location, you can change biological question, and you can change sort of model system or research approach. And the strongest applications probably change all three, because that will give you the most training potential. But obviously if you're not training one or the other of those things. So if you do choose to stay at the same institution and there is some reason for it, I think I would always say that's something that probably letter writers could, I've written letters for several people who've stayed at Emory, and I just toss into the letter something I know about why they're staying at Emory, but they're still getting amazing training potential because now they're in a completely different environment. They're not even in the same building. They're going to be interacting with different people. So it's always about the narrative that you put forth. I think everybody here changed their location. So
I guess there is that section that you write for the F32, that selection of sponsor and institution. So that would probably be a natural place to talk about some of these. I know people have two-body problems or family, reasons that they can't relocate, and that's reasonable, it's fine, but you should address it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree, because reviewers will pick up on it. And if you address it and tell them, they're also, reviewers are human, so they understand there are extenuating circumstances.
Right. So do you have any advice for how to consider the different letter writers, reference letters writers that you could choose? What would you consider to be an ideal letter writer? Is it better to focus on people that have, very strong track records as being scientists, but might not know you personally as well, to focus on those that would know you in the lab better? And is it worthwhile to include any reference letter writers that might be outside of a lab-based setting?
So yeah, everyone's laughing because they know I have strong feelings about this. So I think it's always really important to get letters from people that can evaluate you as a scientist. Obviously your PhD advisor is an obvious person to write the letter. If they're not writing one and there's some reason behind that, that also probably would need to be explained in some way. It's something that could be explained in letters. I think it's always valuable to have someone who has been a scientific collaborator who is outside your training institute. And I always emphasize having people that kind of know you in different ways write you letters. I don't think having someone outside of science write you a letter is critical, unless it fits with your career narrative. For example, I have a trainee currently who wants to go and teach and do research, and that's what her application is designed around. So she does have someone who's a teaching mentor also providing her a letter. I don't know what Derrick, Callie, and Jessica have, like, your letter writers.
All my letter writers were in science, and they all, I can't remember, but I think they all were from my PhD thesis committee, because I had just started my postdoc at that point. But I would recommend, and maybe the trainees shouldn't do this, but if your PI has experience writing these and writing references, that they send an example of a reference to the people who are writing references, because I think sometimes they may not write the appropriate type of reference or answer the critical questions. And those references can be really, really important for you to get funded. So I would definitely recommend you talking to your mentor about that.
Yeah, and just before Callie or Jessica jump in, there's a specific, they're in specific instructions, and I have shared those with ASCB. We actually have something we share in our class. There's specific bullet points that are supposed to be addressed. I write a lot of these letters, and I just list out the bullet points, and I say how each person fits them. And so I also have a sample letter, so we could share those with ASCB to make available to people who are listening. And then, sorry, Callie or Jessica, if you have any thoughts.
Sure. I was just going to jump in, and Derrick kind of alluded to it here, but I think it does kind of matter on your timing of where you are in your postdoc, because when you are very early on, you have very little contacts at your new institution if you moved institutions. So, but for me, since I was already a year and a half in, I found it very important to actually get letters from people that we were outside, either in my department, but not, in my immediate vicinity. But then also getting somebody outside of my department at MD Anderson was really helpful. And then the other thing I'll add is that every application is going to have those 3 required references, but you're allowed up to 5. So I'd say if you can get all 5, but they're quality all 5, I'll put that disclaimer in there too. You don't just want somebody writing you a standard letter, but if you have 5 quality references, do all 5 because that will set you apart.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I agree. So 2 of my letter writers, one was my graduate advisor and the other was a committee member from my graduate work. I had the opportunity as a graduate student to serve on the leadership board of an academic society. And so I actually asked one of the faculty sponsors for that leadership group to write my 3rd letter. So this was a woman who runs her own lab and is a scientist, but her letter was going to be speaking more to my leadership, organization, motivation. And that I thought was very important because it kind of, I hoped that it would present a more well-rounded picture of myself, not just as a scientist, but also as someone who could, you know, be a useful faculty member and participate and lead in the future. So that's something like that could be an option.
Thanks. So when you're choosing your collaborators, how important is their track record in training specifically, or is it more about their scientific expertise with respect to the grant?
Yeah, and I was going to just add one thing just to make sure, because just to be clear, that recommendation letters cannot come from collaborators. So that creates a conflict of interest. I've seen a few grants over the years where they tried to do that, and those grants have actually been administratively rejected. For collaborators, the science is really the important thing. Usually you're pulling that person in because you need a specific expertise. And so demonstrating that they have the ability to provide that scientific expertise, I would say, is way more important than anything about their training. And I think that even if you're getting training from that person, I don't think you necessarily have to show they have an awesome training record, because your goal is to learn the science.
Awesome. Does anybody else have anything to add with respect to that question?
We're good.
Good? Okay. Is there any importance to gaining teaching experience during your postdoctoral period? Or does it help your application if you do have a strong background in teaching?
I don't know if it helps if you have a strong background in teaching for the F32, but it doesn't hurt if you put in, I think you have to break down your % effort or something to that effect in the F32. And if you put 15% is going to be utilized for teaching or learning how to teach, etc., I think that bodes well because you want to demonstrate that you have interest in being a faculty member. And so I don't think it hurts, but you don't want to put like, I'm going to do 50% teaching, 50% research in your proposal.
Yeah, I wrote at length about how I definitely wanted a career where I was doing independent research, but had significant interaction with undergraduates. So I talked about a lot of teaching opportunities that I would pursue, again, being very specific. And in my percentage breakdown, I said by year 3, it would be up to 10% of my % effort. And one of the reviewers actually commented and said, I would hope that she is able to contribute even more effort in her 3rd year if she's this excited about undergraduate teaching. So I was a little bit worried submitting that maybe they would be worried about not contributing all my effort to the bench, but they seemed like this is an area of development and maybe even try to pursue more. So that was very encouraging, I thought.
Well, I think, and to your point, Callie, that has to do with the whole narrative, right? Because that's what you were putting forth as your goal for the future. And obviously to help you get there, you would need that kind of experience, right? So if you say, I want to go to a research institute and I want to run my research lab, you still are teaching. I'm sorry, you're mentoring people in the lab, but you might have less of a requirement for that. So again, what you set out as your goal, the training has to be designed in a very specific way to get you there.
Great.
And I'll just add to that too, that even if it's not any formal teaching experiences that you're going to highlight on your application, it could be important to highlight your mentoring your mentoring experience. Like for me, I have mentored numerous graduate students that are either rotating through the lab, or I also participate in a summer mentoring experience for 10 weeks during the summer. So I did highlight those things as showing that I have past experience mentoring students, but then I'm also going to continue in reaching out in these programs and really making sure that I can be the best mentor that I can be.
All right, thank you all. So for one last question, is there anything that you wish that you knew before submitting your F32 application? Something that was difficult or unexpected that came up and you wish, you could go back and tell yourself about it before you submitted?
I don't know. I had never written this type of grant before. So if I could go back to grad school and say, write an F31, I would do that. But no, I can't think of anything right now.
The only thing I'll say is that I wish I could go back and be able to predict a little bit better. Sorry, that's my dog. Predict a little bit better that what reviewers we're going to see is pretty important criticisms as far as it's okay. As far as, because I did change fields quite a bit, so I should have probably predicted that in my training potential to highlight those areas and anticipate what they would say. So for example, I have no background in immunology and I am now working in immunotherapy. So if I could just go back and think a little bit more critically about where my shortcomings were, I would have put, I'll take a graduate level immunology course, something like that, where I could have anticipated those sorts of questions. So I think it's important just to really think critically about yourself and where maybe your shortcomings are in your new field and try and anticipate those sorts of critiques.
Yeah, I guess the one thing that surprised me, because I had written an F31, so I felt good about the process, kind of all the things that would go into it. The part that surprised me was how much the proposal changed. And I'm talking about like specifically the research aspect of it, how much it morphed over the probably 4 or 5 months that we were really intently working on it. And I mean, thinking about a first version and the ideas that we had versus where we ended was wildly different. And that was a pretty different experience than what I had as writing an F31. So that was surprising to me that even within like a general idea you might have, the specific experiments are going to really change, and to kind of allow yourself to stay flexible and think about what really are the best experiments to put forward and not just get kind of stuck in one way of thinking about this grant from the start.
I think just to add to that, Callie, is this sort of goes to the process, right? But as you work through the experiments, and if you think through like, okay, when I design this experiment, what could happen? What kind of information would I get? And would it actually test my hypothesis? That's usually when you go through a process of refining the experimental approaches you're employing and really thinking about like, okay, if I'm sitting there looking at the results of this experiment, what is it going to tell me?
Right. And like I said, having written it early on in my postdoc, I was still really getting immersed in the field. So I would, over the process of reading more and more papers to write, I would find different techniques and learn about new things. And again, okay, well then maybe we should revisit this experiment. So I think just staying flexible.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all. So we would just like to thank all of our panelists, our speaker, and also all of you for attending the webinar as well. I did just paste a survey and share it via the chat function. If you could please fill it out, both about this particular session and about suggestions for future sessions, we would really appreciate it. Thank you all again for participating in this webinar.
Thank you, Val.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
So much.
Thanks, Jessica's dog.